Tomorrow night, I'm gonna smash your boy, guys. I'm gonna smash your boy.
Yo, what's going on, fight fans? Today we're going to be covering Mr. Smash Your Boy himself, Khabib. Khabib's first opponent ever was a guy named Vucel Bayramov, who was 1-0 prior to their bout. They were both 19 years old. He had 4 more professional fights afterwards, going 1-3. He ended his career with a record of 1-4. He had 1 TKO win on his record prior to fighting Khabib. That was his 1 on his 1-4 record. Khabib defeated him by a submission triangle choke. Next up was Magomedov, who was 0-4 at the time. All 4 losses were by submission. I couldn't find any information on his age. He had 6 more professional fights, going 3-3, and he ended his career with a record of 3-9. Khabib defeated him by a decision. Khabib at this time was 1-0, obviously. He was 20 years old, and his 1 win was by a submission. Next up was Ramazan Kurbanizmailov, who was 1-0 at the time, 19 years old. He had 17 more fights after Khabib, going 11-4-2, and he ended his career with a record of 12-5-2. He had 1 decision win on his record prior to fighting Khabib, and Khabib defeated him by a decision. Khabib at this time was 2-0, 20 years old, with 1 submission and 1 decision win on his record. Next up, Shamil Abdulkarimov. He was 2-0 at the time, with those 2 wins by a submission and a decision. He was 27 years old. He had 4 more professional fights afterwards, going 2-2, and he ended his career with a record of 4-3. Khabib defeated him by a decision. Khabib at this time was 3-0, 20 years old. He had 1 submission, 2 decision wins. Next up was Saeed Ahmed, who was 0-0 at the time. It was his debut fight, his only fight actually ever. It was Khabib's first ever KO win, and I don't blame this guy for never coming back to MMA. Khabib at this time was 4-0, 20 years old, and he had 1 submission and 3 decision wins. Next up is kind of interesting. It's a man named Eldar Eldarov. He was 1-0, just a kid at the time that they fought. He was 18 years old, and he ended up going on to have 13 more fights, going 13-0. He retired in 2022, riding a 13-fight win streak, with his only loss coming to Khabib by a TKO punches. At this time, Khabib was 5-0, 20 years old, with 1 submission, 1 KO, and 3 decision wins on his record. Next up, Shabolit Shamelov. He was 2-0 at the time, 26 years old. He had 13 more fights afterwards, going 11-2-1, and he ended his career with a record of 12-3-1. Khabib defeated him by a submission armbar. Khabib at this time was 6-0, with 21 years old. He had 1 submission, 2 KO, and 3 decision wins. Ali Bagov. This guy looks like he's on gear, trend, steroids, whatever you name. He's 19 years old at the time of their fight. He's still fighting to this day. He's had 41 more fights, going 31-10. His current record stands at 34-11-0. He holds 3 KO wins, 24 submission, and 7 decision wins. So his submission game is there. Khabib defeated him by a decision. And at the time, Khabib was 7-0, 21 years old, with 2 submission, 2 KO, and 3 decision wins on his record. Next up was Vitaly Ostrovsky. He was 5-5 with an equal record. He was 23 years old, and he had 11 more fights afterwards, going 4-7. He ended his career with a record of 9-11. Khabib defeated him via a TKO with punches. Khabib at the time was 8-0, 21 years old, with 2 submission, 2 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. Next up was Alexander Agafonov. He was 4-2 at the time, 25 years old. He had 2 more fights, going 1-1. He ended his career with a record of 5-3, and Khabib defeated him by a TKO with a corner stoppage. Khabib at this time was 9-0, 22 years old, with 2 submission, 3 KO, and 4 decision wins. The cumulative record of all of the guys that he fought before, the 9 opponents, were 12-10. Next up was Saeed Kalilov, who was 13-9. He was stepping up in competition here. The guy was 29 years old. He had 3 more fights afterwards, going 0-3. He ended his career with a record of 13-13, equal. Khabib defeated him by a submission with a Kimura. Khabib at this time was 10-0, 22 years old, 2 submission wins, 4 KO, and 4 decisions. Now you're thinking he's probably going to take a step up in competition after this. Wrong. He faced a guy that was 0-2. Ashot Shahinian. I couldn't find any information on his age. He only had 4 more fights, going 2-2, and he ended his career with a record of 2-5. Khabib knocked him out with punches. At this time, Khabib was 11-0, 22 years old, with 3 submission, 4 KO, and 4 decision wins. What was he doing fighting a guy that was 0-2? The cumulative record of all 11 opponents before this was 25-21. Just for some comparison to this, at this time, John Jones on his 12th pro fight was fighting Brandon Vera. GSP was fighting Sean Shirk. DJ was fighting Benavidez for the flyweight belt. BJ Penn was fighting Lyoto Machida. Alex Pereira was fighting at UFC 300 against Jamal Hill. And Khabib is here fighting a guy that's 0-2. Next up, at 12-0, Khabib was fighting a guy that was 1-1 named Kazik Abadzyan. I couldn't find any information on his age. He had 4 more fights going 2-4. He ended his career with a record of 3-6, and Khabib defeated him by a submission with triangle choke. Khabib at the time of this fight was 12-0, 22 years old. He had 3 submission, 5 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. The cumulative record of 12 opponents before him, 25-23. Next up was Hamiz Mamedov, who was 5-2 at the time. Couldn't find any information on his age as well. He had 4 more fights going 4-0 afterwards. He ended his career with a record of 8-4, and Khabib defeated him by a submission with a triangle choke. Khabib at this time was 13-0, 22 years old. He had 4 submission, 5 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. Next up, I don't know what was going on here. This is 2 fights before his UFC debut, and he's fighting a guy that is making his debut. The guy was 21 years old. He had 14 more fights afterwards, going 10-4. He ended his career with a record of 10-5, and Khabib defeated him by a submission with a triangle choke. Khabib at this time was 14-0. That's like Ian Gary right now, fighting a guy making his debut fight. Khabib he was 22 years old. He had 5 submission, 5 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. Just for some comparison, John Jones in his 15th pro fight won the light heavyweight title from Shogun. GSP in his 15th pro fight was winning the welterweight title from Matt Hughes. DJ in his 15th pro fight was defending the flyweight belt for the 3rd time against Benavidez. Pereira hasn't even had a 15th fight, and he's already defended the title 3 times. BJ Penn was fighting Matt Hughes, and Lyoto Machida was winning the lightweight title against Rashad Evans. There's no comparison in competition here. Next up was Ari Marcel Santos, who was 28-22 at the time, 27 years old. He had 41 more fights afterwards, going 21-20. He has a current record of 47-43 because he's still fighting, and Khabib defeated him by a TKO with punches. Khabib at the time of this fight was 15-0, 23 years old, with 6 submission, 5 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. Finally, we get to Khabib's UFC debut. We have Kamal Shaloris, who was 7-1-2 at the time, 39 years old. He had 5 more fights afterwards, going 2-3, and he ended his career with a record of 9-5-2. Khabib defeated him by a submission with a rear naked choke. Khabib was 16-0 coming into the UFC, 23 years old, with 6 submission, 6 KO, and 4 decision wins on his record. The cumulative record of everyone before him coming into the UFC, 59-48. Next up was Gleison Tibau. This is the fight that is very controversial and people say that he lost. At this time, Gleison was 28 years old. He had 23 more fights afterwards, going 12-11. He ended his career with a record of 39-19, and Khabib defeated him by a decision. Khabib at this time was 17-0, 23 years old. He had 7 submission wins, 6 KO, and 4 decisions. Moving on, we got Thiago Tavares, and now we're finally starting to take some steps up in a competition that actually means something. He was 17-4-1 at the time of the Khabib fight. He was 28 years old. He had 13 more fights, going 7-6, and he ended his career with a record of 24-11. Khabib defeated him by a KO in the first round with punches and elbows. Khabib at this time was 18-0, 24 years old, 7 submission, 6 KO, and 5 decision wins into his career. Next up was Abel Trujillo, who was 10-4 at the time, 29 years old. He had 9 more fights afterwards, going 5-3-1, and he ended his career with a record of 5-8-1. Khabib defeated him via decision unanimous. Khabib at the time of this fight was 19-0, 24 years old, with 7 submission, 7 KO, and 5 decision wins on his record. The cumulative record of everyone at this point, 110-60. Next up was Pat Healy, 30 years old. He had 12 more fights, going 5-7 in those. He ended his career with a record of 34, 24-1. Jesus Christ. Khabib defeated him via unanimous decision. Khabib at this time was 20-0, 25 years old, 7 submission, 7 KO, and 6 decision wins into his career. RDA. This is the fight that I feel like kind of took him up. He was 21-0 at the time. RDA was 29 years old. He's had another 22 fights since and still going, 12-10. RDA, after this fight, went on a 4-fight win streak to win the lightweight championship from Anthony Pettis that year. In under a year, he did that. He's currently sitting at a record of 32-17. His career so far consists of 5 KO, 11 subs, and 16 decision wins, so he's no scrub. Khabib has defeated him by a decision unanimous, and after this, Khabib got his knee injury and was out for 2 years until 2016. At this point, Khabib was 21-0, 25 years old, with 7 submissions, 7 KO, and 7 decision wins on his record. Daryl Horcher, I don't understand this fight at all. This guy was making his UFC debut. I get Khabib had a 2-year layoff, but he just finished beating the former lightweight champion. And he went up against a guy that had 7 more fights afterwards, going 2-5. He ended his career 14-7. He went 1-4 in the UFC with 1 split decision win over Devin Powell, and Khabib beat him by a TKO with punches. Like, you better hope you do. Khabib at this time was 22-0, 27 years old, with 7 submissions, 7 KO, and 8 decision wins on his record. By this point in their career, John Jones was already fighting Daniel Cormier for the first time for defense number 8. GSP was fighting Dan Hardy for defense number 4. Demetrius Johnson was landing a flying armbar on Ray Borg for defense number 11. And BJ Penn was knocking out Diego Sanchez for defense number 3. Meanwhile, Khabib is over here beating up Daryl Horcher. Anyways. Next up was Michael Johnson, who was 17-10 at the time of their fight. He was 30 years old, and he's had 13 more fights, going 5-8. He currently is sitting at a record of 22-19. Khabib defeated him by his submission, Kimura. Khabib at the time of this fight was 23-0, 28 years old, with 7 submission, 8 KO, and 8 decision wins on his record. Next up was the famous Edson Barboza fight. He was 19-4 at the time, 31 years old. He's had 12 more fights, going 5-7. He's currently sitting at a record of 24-12, and Khabib defeated him by a unanimous decision. Khabib at the time of the fight was 24-0, 29 years old, with 8 submission, 8 KO, and 8 decision wins on his record. Keeping it pretty even there. Next, he fought for the vacant UFC lightweight championship against Al Iaquinta. He was 13-3-1 at the time. Iaquinta was not eligible to win the title because of weight. He was 30 years old. He had 3 more fights, going 1-2, losing to Cowboy and Bobby Green in those. He ended his career with a record of 14-7-1, and Khabib defeated him by a unanimous decision. Khabib at the time was 25-0, 29 years old, with 8 submission, 8 KO, and 9 decision wins on his record. The cumulative record of 25 people before him, 217-100. Next up is the Conor McGregor brawl. He was 30 years old. He was 21-3 at the time, Conor. He's had 3 more fights after, going 1-2, with those 2 losses being to, I believe, Dustin Poirier. He's currently sitting at a record of 22-6. Khabib defeated him by a submission neck crank and then jumped out of the cage and beat up his Dylan Dennis afterwards. Khabib at the time of the fight was 26-0, 30 years old, with 8 submission, 8 KO, and 10 decision wins on his record. Then Khabib went on to fight Dustin Poirier, who was 25-5-1 at the time. He was 30 years old. He's had 8 more fights, going 5-3 in those. He's currently sitting at a record of 39-1. Khabib defeated him by a submission with a rear naked choke. And at the time, Khabib was 27-0, 30 years old, with 9 submission, 8 KO, and 10 decision wins on his record. Khabib's final fight was Justin Gaethje, who was 22-2, tearing up the division at the time. He was 31 years old. He's had 5 more fights afterwards, going 3-2. He's currently sitting at a record of 25-5, and Khabib defeated him via submission triangle choke. At the time, Khabib was 28-0, 32 years old, with 10 submission, 8 KO, and 10 decision wins on his record. The total combination of every single opponent before him at the time of their fight, 276 and 111. Lastly, I just wanted to run by some of these numbers that I found quite interesting when doing the research. His total combined record of all of his opponents at the time of fighting Khabib was 298-113. The combined total record of all of his opponents after fighting Khabib was 181-135. The combined total record of all of his opponents throughout their entire career was 484-275. 13 out of 29 opponents that Khabib faced had less than 5 total fights. That's 45% of his opponents. 16 out of 29 had losing records after fighting Khabib. That's 55%. He only defeated 2 former champions in his career, being Conor McGregor and RDA. His final 7 UFC fights were against all strikers: Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, Conor McGregor, Ali Quinta, Barboza, Michael Johnson, and Daryl Horcher. And in those final 7 opponents, they all had a combined record of 91 knockouts with only 15 submission wins. And out of those 15, 8 were Poirier. So he did not face any threats in that submission game throughout the final 7 opponents, which were his real threats that actually mean something on his record. I found that quite interesting. He didn't fight any of the Charles Oliveira's, the Michael Chandlers, or anyone with really any wrestling pedigree. And then the final thing I wanted to show here was this photo I actually ended up finding on Reddit from about 4 years ago. And it was all of the champions at the time with their combined opponent's record at the time of them facing them, along with Khabib. The poster made a mistake here with the 289. It's actually 298. I just made the video if you watched. And I actually broke down these into percent. So Stipe's percentage is 79.81% win percentage of opponents when facing him. Jan had 74.31. Izzy had 77.07. Kamaru had 78.22. Volk had 76.73. Jan had 82.13. That's the highest out of them all. Davison Figueiredo had 79.38. I threw in John Jones on here. He had an even 80% at the time of facing him. And Khabib had the lowest out of everyone with 71.71%. It's not... I mean, I think the guy is a bit overrated to the people that call him one of the GOATs, in my opinion. I think he's a top 10, top 15 fighter at best. Sorry, guys.